Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
To the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I'm joined by
Bob Bazanko. I'm back in the Lone Star State with triple-digit temperatures and guns and reactionaries and you name it. So,
right-wing politicians trying to barricade off the state from undesirables, the deplorables, if you will, with buzzsaws in the Rio Grande, and I'm sure they'll have checkpoints checking for people for their Communist Party membership cards before too long.
It's the American Taliban here running the state. So
yeah. And it's also like the Lone Star oven too, just with the way it's everything's cooking there.
Yep. Ohio was like the best weather in the country this summer. That's bizarre. Become a tourist trap pretty soon.
Your property in Ohio is going to be like, pretty high value before it's all over and done.
I can sell it and then become a speculator in Hawaii, which you're going to talk about later. So
yeah, exactly. To maybe kick it off, we can do this week in radical history. We have just a couple because some of the other things we have kind of lined up will probably take a little bit longer. August 14th, 1945, the August Revolution begins in Vietnam, which succeeds and leads to a Vietnamese Declaration of Independence on September 2nd, which was based on the Declaration of Independence written by Americans in 1776. The U.S. in turn funded French efforts to retake the country. So you can see where the U.S. really stands on independence and democracy. On August 17th, 3 days later, 1945, Indonesia declares independence following the defeat of Japan in World War II. The Netherlands had colonized the country for 350 years, began a 4-year war, which they oddly justified as a continuation of the World War II fight for democracy. Because European colonizers, that's their big thing, is fight for democracy. Same thing happens in 1946 to 1954 in Vietnam with the French as well. And then the last thing I want to mention for this week in radical history is on August 16th, 1849, a 20-year-old Italian anarchist and baker, Sante Geronimo Casario, was guillotined in Lyon, France, because he had assassinated the president of France 2 months before. And as you know, probably from some of our social media and at least one previous episode, we're big fans of anarchist bakers. Our friend and comrade Jen Angel is a known local who sadly passed away earlier this year. Was an anarchist baker, and so we have great love for them.
I have a couple of anarchists to talk about too. It's interesting though, you mentioned the Vietnam. If anybody wants more on that, go back. One of our, I think, still best shows we've ever done, which gave birth to the M19 Brigade, was when we did a show on Ho Chi Minh and Malcolm X, and we actually spoke at some length about Ho's background and the fight for independence. And
we repost that every May 19th.
Yeah. So there's some good stuff in there. It's also interesting to note, because you mentioned Indonesia as well, and Vietnam and Indonesia, really all over Korea and Europe. The resistance in World War II was led by the left, often the Communist Party, and who defeated the fascists, right? So Antifa, like they're the good guys, right? And when the war ended in all of these places, the establishment,
they're the good guys unless you're an actual fascist. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, if you're against the Antifa, that means you're pro-fa, right? So,
yeah, pro-fa.
At the end of the war, the established regimes and the United States especially went after these resistance fighters. So the people who had defeated the Japanese fascists or the Nazis or whoever found themselves in the sights of the United States as the new enemy. So that's worth mentioning too. But what I want to talk about today is something that's actually very well known. On August 23rd, 1927, so we're close to 100 years of that, Sacco and Vanzetti two names which I think are fairly familiar to most of us, were murdered by the state of Massachusetts. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested in 1920, in April of 1920. This was amid a big national kind of crusade against immigrants, something that we're familiar with today as well. There was this kind of fear that, you know, traditional whitehood was being challenged. And Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were from Italy. They were both anarchists. They often passed out literature and tried to talk to people about anarchy. And they also carried loaded pistols, which was the style at the time and quite understandable given the pressures they were under. The authorities arrested Sacco and Vanzetti and charged them with the murder of two men during a payroll robbery. The trial became a national phenomenon. There was no evidence linking Sacco and Vanzetti to the crime. When the trial began, the judge was Webster Thayer. The name itself really fits, right? He's a conservative, traditional white Ivy League judge who often lectured and wrote about the evils of Bolshevism and anarchism, and he was presiding. The facts of the crime were almost irrelevant because the testimony against Sacco and Vanzetti was based on their ethnicity, their political views, hysteria about the Red Scare, and Thayer's political ideas were obvious from the start. He rejected all the defense motions and said in court, no long-haired anarchists from California can run this court. He said that is the lawyers. Later, according to sworn affidavits, he called Sacco and Vanzetti Bolsheviks, and he bragged that he would get them good and proper. Conviction obviously was inevitable, and they were found guilty. Sacco and Vanzetti appealed. Thayer said to his friends after the verdict, "Did you see what I did to those anarchistic bastards the other day? I guess that'll hold them for a while. Let them go to the Supreme Court now and see what they could get out of them." All of that became public, and it didn't matter. The convictions were upheld, and on August 23rd, 1927, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed by the state. And this was part of a big, as I said before, crusade at the time. Around this time, you're also seeing the Scopes trial in Tennessee, the rise of kind of right-wing evangelicals like Amy Semple McPherson and Billy Sunday. So I think a lot of what was happening,
revival of the Klan in the 20s.
Revival of the Klan. So I think it really fits in to what we're seeing today. So when you see, you know, whether it be in the United States, people we've talked about like Jennifer Resnick, or we've talked about Dan McGowan,
Jessica Resnick.
I'm sorry, Dan McGowan, Jay Conroy, or you know, any group like that has, this is a long American tradition. Sacco and Vanzetti really are a part of that. And I've told you many times growing up, I mean, that was kind of, as an Italian American community, you know, we often heard about Sacco and Vanzetti. And so that's, you know, actually probably more important to many of us than Columbus Day would ever be. But I think it's worth noting in 2023, that's something that happened in 90 some, over 100 years ago, actually, the arrest is really kind of similar to what's happening today. I mean, look at the rhetoric about immigrants and criminals, and what did Trump call them? Rapists and drug addicts and this and that.
Drug dealers, yeah.
Drug dealers and rapists. So I think it's kind of the same stuff. And it was Sacco and Vanzetti and Italians in the 1920s. I think, I forget how many, I think 1,000 Italians, just Italian anarchists were deported. So this is the kind of stuff that goes on when you're, you know, when your society is really in decay. Clearly the US is in decay right now. You have to look for external forces to blame it on. And immigrants are often, you know, in that group. They are that group. And so that's why I think Sacco and Vanzetti is really important. And that legacy is something we should be aware of. And, you know, everyone who's studied it since then is exonerated them. There was no evidence linking them to the event that day. And it was just, you know, as you can imagine, we've seen trials in America, right? I mean, what's the name of that little shitty kid who killed 2 people? Rittenhouse was acquitted.
Kyle Rittenhouse.
Yeah, so, you know, trials in America and this fetishism about the courts really has to stop, because, you know, I think the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, unfortunately, is far more American than most of us would like. It's often presented as this outrage of justice, but the reality is Sacco and Vanzetti type trials occur every day in America. And victims like Assange, right? Or Chelsea Manning, or there's just Stevens Donziger, right?
Mhm.
I think of him. There are just so many examples out there. So,
well, if you think about, like in 1927, they executed, anarchists. Today, they just destroy people's lives by Chelsea Manning was held in solitary confinement for huge amounts of times where it kind of cracked their mental health. And Donziger has been been kind of dragged through it through the course of everything that he went through. It's Assange.
They're torturing him.
It's
torture.
Yeah. It's almost like instead of executing now, they just torture people with this ugly
Reality
process.
Winner did what, 4 years? Reality Winner
for like a one-page memo. How much time has Trump done for boxes upon boxes of?
They're afraid. This guy's allowed to threaten judges, and it's okay, because Merrick Gelding would never do anything about that.
The right-wing trolls are now targeting the Georgia grand jury, which indicted him in Georgia the other day.
The judge in DC now has security. It's pretty unfortunate, but Sacco and Vanzetti. There's so many examples like that, but that one I think is well known, and I think it's meaningful, and it's not important like just because it's history. It's important because this is America. This is what we're seeing today.
Yeah.
And so, and again, I think this gets back, and I don't want to go off on another end because I know we have stuff to do today. But and we said this all the time, like in 2020, this idea that like Trump was unique and no one like him had ever existed. We'd never seen anything like him. Trump's attack on immigrants that's America. It's not unique. And what you're seeing today, you don't have the rhetoric from Biden. He's not calling them rapists and criminals, but immigration policy isn't all that different. So,
some think it's worse.
Yeah, you just had a 3-year-old kid just died in transit, right? An immigrant kid, and you have the stuff that Abbott's doing, and Biden's really not doing anything about it. So, Sacco and Vanzetti are, in many ways, one of the core foundational stories of American society. And so, thinking about them right now.
Yep.
So it's time. We have not actually said what we're doing here. It's Scrappy Sunday.
Oh, it is Scrappy Sunday, and apologies. It's the end of the summer. It's end of a scrappy summer, and so we're just getting as scrappy as we can get. I'm feeling quite scrappy about things today.
Like the Beach Boys, you've been having fun all summer long, right?
Yeah. It's going to be a busy, scrappy fall, I can tell you that.
Yeah, we could do that as our outro music today, the Beach Boys. I don't think we've ever used the Beach Boys.
No, I don't think
we try to get a little edgier, but I'm getting old, so I'm kind of softening. But what did Dylan say? Maybe I'm too sensitive, or else I'm getting soft. So
yeah, that's how I always think of you, Bob. Sensitive and soft.
That's kind of how I am. Kind of like Bert Young in Back to School, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the next thing we're feeling a little bit scrappy about is the climate crisis, and there's a lot of news actually going on around this every day. But there were a couple of things that we wanted to bring up today. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the Maui fires. Terrible wildfires in the last week devastated Maui, the island of Maui, Western Maui to be specific. 106 people. Have the body counts at 106 people dead now. There's still people missing. They're still looking for people. So that it's the actual, as far as lives go, it's the worst, one of the worst natural disasters in recent American history. I think the last wildfire was the Paradise Fire in Paradise, California in 2018, where 85 people died. But the Maui fires have surpassed that now. It's also estimated that it will be at least, insurance companies are saying it'll be at least $5.5 billion to rebuild Western Maui after this. And just to put it in a little bit of context, in the last 10 years, the US government has spent about $350 billion on climate related disasters. The fires devastated a iconic town. It was actually at one point one of the capitals of the ancient Hawaiian kingdom, called Lahaina Town. There was an iconic banyan tree there that was burned. It had like 16 trunks. It was the largest in the U.S. It had just turned 150 years old in April. But the whole town of Lahaina was actually burned to the ground. And this is a result of a combination of, according to the National Weather Service, of a downed power line, plus hurricane force winds, which were hitting the island, dry vegetation, and low humidity. 3 out of 4 of those are caused by climate change. So just to kind of put that into a little bit of context, but there's a sort of man-made disaster which really contributed to this. Lahaina actually used to be a wetland, and what has happened is become like a sort of parched desert area now as a result of water for like what I call the true invasive species, which is the ruling class. And so they have built things like golf courses and hotels and resorts. They've actually done a lot of what they call monocropping, where we used to have sugar and sugarcane and pineapple, but those didn't actually make enough money. So corporations, there's like 5 corporations, big ag corporations operating in Maui, which have actually made it more vulnerable to fire because they've been growing, it is fertile land. So they've been actually growing lots of other crops there just to kind of like, fill their pockets. Also lots of environmental justice, public health issues, because when they were clearing the sugarcane out, they would like rain ash down on local communities. And you had an epidemic of asthma, for example, in this community. And, also to say that this is like recent history is actually also not true. White colonizers, missionaries, whatever you want to say, have been coming and doing things like this in Hawaii for, a century or two, right? So
1893,
a century.
The Marines ousted Queen Liliuokalani. Luckily, it was a bloodless coup because it could have been an utter massacre. And I always tell my students, as I said, and the governor general put in charge was Sanford Dole. And why is that name important? And they all like, it takes them a second, and they all start giggling, like Dole fruit, like yep.
Not Bob Dole, Dole pineapple.
They overthrew the government and put the guy from the big fruit corporation in charge. I mean, that's they weren't hiding it back then. So yeah, next thing that would be like making like Rex Tillerson the head of foreign policy, and no one would do that, right?
No.
Or Bob McNamara, or Jim Baker, or Tony Blinken, or whatever. So,
John Kerry.
Yeah. So yeah, clearly, I just want to throw that in. Hawaii was an American colony for a long time, and according to a lot of Hawaiians I know, it still is. There's actually, and the left isn't really aware. There's actually I think what's it called, the land title movement or something like that. People we know actually are involved in that, who to this day still claim. I think they're right that that's their land. It was just taken away.
And but we talked about Standing Rock a couple of times on this show. At the same time as we see a resurgence of indigenous rights movements, indigenous sovereignty movements in the U.S., like particularly like on Dakota land and the Dakotas and Minnesota and places like that. Similar things have been happening in Hawaii, where we see this Native Hawaiian movement. Actually, they were fighting back where the university wanted to build a telescope on like sacred land.
Yeah.
So the indigenous Hawaiian movements are actually very strong right now as well. And they've actually been a lot of the ones that providing the mutual aid for the victims of the fires too. It's like it's not like they can send in National Guard and support from other states, neighboring states, like you can in the continental US. It's an island, and so that's much more difficult. But you have been seeing mutual aid from the Native Hawaiian indigenous movements.
Yeah.
But then the other trend, which is much more man-made as well, is we're seeing this sort of disaster profiteering, this climate profiteering going on. And there's like a lot of recent stories about how real estate developers are cold calling Lahaina residents, trying to get them to sell their property so they don't have to wait for compensation from their house burning out. There was a story in the Guardian about it this week. And it's a big fight. They actually had a grassroots campaign where local activists, partially this Native Hawaiian movement, had actually fought the government to get water rights back into under public control. And right as they were about to pass it, the fires happened. And so the pro real estate developer governor, what party is he? Josh Green. Is he a libertarian, Bob? No.
Are there any? I don't think there are any. There are no Republicans in office, higher office in Hawaii, are they?
He's a Democrat.
No, so I'm saying that's a totally blue state.
Yeah.
And they lost Tulsi. She was their diversity, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They had the batshit party, and she represented that. So.
But the Democratic governor, Josh Green, has enacted all of these emergency laws as a result of the fires. They were about to pass like water protection and stream protection, and like I said, they were going to return the water permitting back more under public control. And lo and behold, Josh Green has put a hold on that. The civil servant who was like the deputy director of the Water Commission, I think, who his name was Kaleo Manuel, had actually been the public face of returning this to a more public to more public control. Actually, they removed him because they say he's actually the one responsible for the fires, which seems to be a little bit of a misnomer. But this is a classic case of climate profiteering, disaster profiteering, where a small elite group, which are Democratic office holders and lobbyists and the West Maui Land Trust and things like that, are using a profound tragedy to roll back grassroots victory for water rights. And so it's just really sort of like disgusting. What we're seeing is like we've seen this happen in New Orleans. We saw this happen in Houston. We've seen this happen in Puerto Rico in 2017. This is pretty much how it goes. Is like poor people, communities are hit hard by this stuff, and then the rich people come in to see what they can get out of it.
In the last several years, people on the left have talked a lot about disaster capitalism as if it's something new. And maybe it is a dig at the person who wrote the book, because again, this is capitalism. I mean, if you look at the Civil War, right, the so-called carpetbaggers, right, you had this influx of Northern capital flood into the South after 1865. And every time there's any kind of calamity like that, that's what happened. This isn't new. It's not some new form of capitalism or anything like that. Capitalism actually needs that, right? It needs to find these kinds of areas that are exploited to go in there and take advantage of it. As you point out, like after Houston, people I know, luckily I've never been hit that hard, whether it be Allison or Harvey or Ike, but a lot of people I know were immediately hit by these, shysters coming through who were offering them money for their places and things like that. So it's a bad scene. So I was gonna actually, that's a good segue too, because you talked about the Democratic Party, and the head of the Democratic Party is Joe Biden, who I think has said that the people in Hawaii will get a one-time $700 stipend, right? Mm-hmm. Their lives are destroyed, but the government's going to give them $700. But
that's not even a rent. That's not even a rent check anymore.
Food, it's a week of food, right?
Yeah.
So, but what's striking is that Biden's doing virtually nothing in Hawaii, really nothing in East Palestine. But one area where he is promising more aid and more involvement is, I'll let you guess.
Could it be Ukraine?
That was just a lucky guess, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Biden has announced another aid package for Ukraine. And I think it's telling that the media isn't really able to hide what's happening there the way it used to. And so I think it's time for another discussion. It's really weird, right? Because usually growing up on the left, like you and I have, wars have never been topics that were not discussed, or that had to be prodded. We always were talking about interventions, whether it be Central America or Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever. But this one has been different. But even now, the media is starting, I think, to kind of come out. So today in the New York Times, there was a headline that said troop deaths and injuries in Ukraine war near 500,000 U.S. officials say. To me, that's quite striking that they would come out with a story like that, with numbers like that. 500,000 casualties is an immense number in a war that has lasted a year and a half, February to now. So it's been 18 months. And these are from U.S. estimates, right? So they're probably somewhat in the ballpark. These reports say that Russia has suffered 300,000 casualties, about 120,000 dead, about 170, 180,000 wounded. Ukraine has suffered 200,000 casualties, about 120,000 dead, about 120,000 wounded. By comparison, in the entire time in Vietnam, the United States lost over 58,000 people. So both of these combatants now have doubled that in 8 months, right? So it's this incredibly brutal and bloody war. And this gets back to the other point we always make, which is that there are so many people who are on the left who are continuing to support this. And we call them NATO liberals, we call them NATO left, people who write for New Politics and Tempest and the Bill Fletchers of the world and others, who are really touting this war because Russia is a bad place, and Russia does. That's true, right? Putin's a monster, Russia's a bad place. But I think what's being lost in this is what I just said right here: 500,000 casualties, and many more to come. Russia has more troops in the field and a larger population to replenish its ranks with. So they can continue to send people in, especially they have the Wagner group, right, which is a very active. Ukraine has about 500,000 troops. Russia has about 1.3 million troops. That's active, reserve, and paramilitary. And in terms of actually having troops, Russia has a big advantage there because geographically they're bigger and they have the Wagner group, which it's easier to kind of force conscription on. The battles themselves have become bloodier. You're seeing more and more artillery, tanks, drones, and the media, initially was playing up a lot of these battles as kind of, a chance for Ukraine to give Russia a deadly blow, especially like at Bakhmut. But these battles have become killing fields, both sides. One thing that I wasn't even thinking of until I read it in this book, battlefield medicine is not that advanced. And one reason that you saw so many people in Afghanistan and Iraq survive is that U.S. battlefield medicine has progressed so much. Like, so in Vietnam, you got killed. Now you have people there. Ukraine and Russia don't have that. So you're starting to see a lot of people who are injured, they're wounded, they're laying there in the battle, or they're dead, they're not being brought back. Even if they are, recovered, the kind of treatment they're getting isn't really, great. There's a distance to bring them to. So a lot of people are losing their lives that way as well. It's a bloodbath, and people on the left really need to take account of that. And this also goes to something else that I talk about a lot. And I want to go back to somebody who I get a lot of teasing, let's just call it that, about the way I defend the guy. But Mark Milley, back last November, Mark Milley said, at the time, I think there were about 100,000 on each side, wounded, casualties. And he said, this is a bloodbath. It's going to get worse. We need to negotiate. We need to do something about this. And in February, he reiterated that. And he caught a lot of, mostly ignored and dismissed, but he caught a lot of flack for it too. Well, now, apparently around the Pentagon, people in hushed tones are saying, Milley was right, or Milley had a point. I think among people, at that level, he's probably the only one who I think has spoken about this in legitimate terms. He's talked about how difficult it is. He talked about the idea that it's going to be a long war, that the odds on it ending anytime soon are not great, that the bloodshed is going to get worse, and that negotiations are needed. Now, Joe Biden has just said that, there will be no negotiations without Ukraine. Ukraine takes the lead on everything. Well, we all know that's bullshit, right? Because Ukraine, on different occasions, was willing to negotiate. They were willing to do. Naftali Bennett has talked about that in March of 2022. Xi Jinping was there earlier this year with a peace proposal. The United States, despite this, it's Ukraine's war. And I've even seen these NATO leftists say this: it's Ukraine's war. The U.S. can't tell them what to do. Like, Are they that naive? Do they really believe that? Do they really believe that the U.S. isn't telling Zelensky what to do? That Zelensky's making the calls and Biden just goes along? Do they believe that? Are they that freaking stupid?
Well, Bob, it's a complicated situation.
It's complicated.
It's complicated.
Like
We can't tell it. We
their
can't tell
dating
it.
profile. It's complicated.
We can't tell another country what to do. It's not like if we had some disagreement with a country, say like Pakistan, who is, not touting the U.S. line on the Ukraine war, then it's not like we would help foment a coup to remove the prime minister. We would never do that,
No.
right? Right?
Uh-uh.
It's just interesting. It's just complicated.
So you have Biden saying,
Just want to throw that out there.
negotiations are up to Ukraine now. We all know that that's bullshit. And we know that this is a proxy war for the United States. The United States is willing to stand tall. There are no Americans killed yet. And, despite the clamor and the claims, there's not likely to be. America's not going to send troops there. They might send some trainers or something like that. They're not going to send combat troops there, right?
No.
But the bloodbath's going to continue. And there are so many reasons to oppose this as socialists or as leftists, right? One, it's a freaking imperial war. And both Russia and the United States are, and Ukraine, right? There aren't good guys in this. There's a lot of bad guys. Some are worse. Putin's a bad guy, no doubt. But, frankly, I think Putin and Zelensky and Biden could all share a cell at The Hague, a docket at The Hague. There'd be reason for that, right? So you have this imperial war that is not going to help the people of Ukraine or Russia. It's not helping the working classes of Europe or anywhere else. It's a bloodbath. If we believe in life, then the sight of these people getting slaughtered is disgusting, right? We should be advocating negotiations, right? I mean, that's kind of what people on the left do. They advocate peace talks and, negotiations, and that may involve concessions. But, the fact is 500,000 people are dead, and you're going to start seeing those numbers getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And just from an American perspective, you just talked about Hawaii, and I was, talking about East Palestine all summer, and there's Flint, and there's Jackson, then there's the American healthcare system, American police, who are just, on a tirade against anybody anymore, right? You see these stories all the time about police getting more funding. What did I just read? Where was it? Some state with all the money they're getting from opioid settlements, from like these cases against the Sackers and others, the cities are taking that money and giving it to the police, right? So with all of this
more law enforcement targeting opioid dealers and users,
right, because
gotcha.
that really helps stop,
because that's been the winning strategy of the war on drugs for almost 50 years now.
More police, that stops drugs, right?
More money into law enforcement. That's awesome.
I could go on and on. The healthcare debt, the education system here in Texas, those Texas Republicans have taken over the Houston schools. They've shut down the libraries, and they're creating discipline centers now. They're getting rid of librarians, bringing cops into the schools. This country is in such decay. We've talked before about there's cholera, there's leprosy, right? I mean, Trump called all these other places shithole countries, and there's plenty of shithole counties in the United States, right? Look at where you are in the Bay Area. You have terrible problems with homelessness and with drug addiction, and all of this is going on. You have these major crises in Hawaii and Vermont, and this heat wave going through.
I have some other stuff that I wanted to talk about today that's actually related to that. So not only are we seeing this sort of, we're seeing this sort of like unraveling of a social fabric, right? Whether it's economics or the failure of these agencies and institutions, and then like right wing or the far right taking them over, which is even worse. But but we have this climate, emergence of more and more climate disasters, everything from like triple digit heat waves all over the country, which we actually covered on a recent Scrappy Sunday, but fires in Maui and 1,000 fires burning in Canada right now, over 1,000 fires. They've just evacuated the largest city in northern Alberta, which is called Yellowknife, because the fires are so bad up there. But then the Biden administration is actually, given the green light to continuing to give the green light to oil and gas projects. There's the Willow project, which is an oil drilling operation in Alaska that it's enraged millions of people around the country. But that's basically just like more fuel into the climate fire. On the same day that he announced his Environmental Protection Agency rules, he also approved Alaska LNG project, which we're actually due to have an interview with someone from Friends of the Earth about sometime in the future. But this is a $40 billion project that's an 800-mile gas pipeline. It's actually being lobbied. It was lobbied for by the ambassador of Japan, what's that guy's name? Rahm Emanuel. So we can like promote, US having like control over oil and gas in like the Asia Pacific region. And then we just had a recent show about how the Biden administration worked with Joe Manchin to greenlight the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And then the one I really want to talk about is there's actually a federal court case, which is going to the Supreme Court called Juliana versus US, where they're basically trying to say that what the oil companies are doing by making an unsafe climate and an environmental atmosphere for us is actually unconstitutional. And the Biden administration, following the same tact as the Trump administration, has actually come out and said that there is no constitutional right to a stable climate. And so, I mean, it's for everything that's happening, and for however Biden talks about being a climate president or this liberal president or this social justice minded president, it's like, it's all just bullshit.
Yeah, Biden claims he's the most climate friendly, the most pro-union, But I think the point is, we shouldn't be out there promoting a war abroad that is costing many billions of dollars, destroying people's lives in Ukraine and Russia, and also is a huge distraction and diversion away from dealing with problems here, myriad problems here in the United States. So I can't say I never imagined I'd see this, because if you live around as long as we have, you see a lot. But to see especially these people on the NATO left continue to pimp this and continue to just be oblivious to the brutal nature of that war, to the people getting killed, to the destruction, to the amount of time it's going to take to rebuild it. And that rebuilding, you talked about all the developers, flooding into Hawaii. I mean, already Zelensky's had meetings with BlackRock, with Goldman, with General Dynamics, with other American banks. And, as soon as that ends, you're going to see this flood, like you did in Eastern Europe, or you did in Russia. I mean, one of the precipitants to this whole thing is the capitalist takeover of the Soviet Union, the ex-Soviet Union, right?
It's the same disaster profiteering that's, I'm sure all those entities are talking to the governor of Hawaii right now too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, all that is going on. Meanwhile, in East Palestine, it looks like it did, the day after the railroad crash.
Yeah.
In Hawaii, God knows. I mean, there are parts of Houston that haven't been rebuilt, It's just this utter ignorance, willful ignorance of the rest of what's going on, right? These are ruling class issues. Who benefits from the war in Ukraine? The ruling class does. Bankers do, and military, suppliers do, but we don't. And for people on the left to continue to promote this is utterly insane. I'll avoid another rant because I think this ties in also to the Cornel West bandwagon. I mean, there's so much, there's so much going on that we need to address, like on a really direct level.
Yep.
And
Yep.
spending our time supporting wars, or spending our time trying to get somebody on a ballot or a celebrity campaign, really just means that no one's trying to stop these hostilities, these brutalities in Ukraine, or anything else that's going on. It's a long story, but the war in Ukraine, once again, we need to listen to Mark Milley. I think like the wisest guy we have is the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I say that with no pleasure. I mean, at the end of the day, these guys aren't allies, but they do have a perspective on the world that is different than much of the ruling class. And if I had to choose between like Biden and Blinken and Milley making decisions, I know who I would take every time. So get out, end the war. It's time to end the war.
End the war.
Negotiate, talk now.
Now. You've been listening to the gleeful rantings of the Green and Red podcast. I think we're good. I think we're good for today.
Try to stay cool out there.
Yep. We love y'all. We love our audience for the Scrappy Sundays, and hope y'all
We've also
enjoy
gotten
our
a
stuff.
couple more. We've gotten a few more patrons, so thank you out there.
Yeah, we've been
Our
patron audience has grown just in the last week.
Yeah.
Very, very happy about that. And if you like the Green and Red podcast and you're not a patron, then check us out at patreon.com/Green Red Podcast. And will be greatly appreciative of it. But also, if you want to make a one-time donation, you can go to greenredpodcast.org and hit that support button. I'm doing a little bit backwards today. And so also, if you like what you're hearing, just feel free to follow us and share our stuff off of Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you are watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you listen to us on the audio platforms, make sure you give us a rate and review. Also, I've gotten some nice reviews lately. Because it all helps us with all those things, help us with the algorithms to become the best and the most interesting lefty boutique podcast out there. And we got more great shows coming up. We're probably going to start recording our series on the anniversary of the JFK assassination soon. The 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile is coming up. Probably have something to say about that, either as an episode or on Scrappy Sunday. There's like lots of interesting things happening in the world, and we want you to keep up with it all because we're trying to keep up with it all. So we'll talk to you all again real soon. Make trouble, misbehave, and take care. Bye.
We always take my car 'cause it's never been beat, and we've never missed yet with the girls we meet.